Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Mark sat in the quiet of his office, the weight of his father's death still heavy on his heart. His mind raced, wondering how it had come to this, a marriage of convenience that could change the course of his life forever. He had barely met the woman he was about to marry, and yet here he was, faced with a decision that could save his family's fortune or ruin him entirely. Eleanor, the woman at the center of it all, was as cold as the marble floors of the mansion she called home, but there was something in her eyes that kept him on edge. He didn't trust her, not fully, but her proposition had seemed too tempting to ignore. "Marry me," she had said. "Think of it as a business arrangement." The terms were clear: no love, no intimacy, just a contract to ensure both their futures. What choice did he have? As the day wore on, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a business deal. Eleanor wasn't the type to offer such an arrangement without a motive. Her cold, calculating demeanor suggested there was something else, something deeper at play. But what was it? Why him? He glanced at the documents in front of him, the legal language of the contract almost a blur. His fingers traced the edges of the papers, wondering how much of his own life he was about to sacrifice. The mansion, the legacy, the money. What good were they without freedom? And yet, here he was, ready to sign away his chance at any normal life. He stood up, pacing the room as his thoughts spiraled. There was a knock at the door, pulling him back to reality. It was his lawyer, Mr. Harris, his face grim. "Mark, I need to talk to you about Eleanor," Mr. Harris said, his voice low. "You need to understand what you're getting into. She's not just trying to save herself. She's trying to get back at your father, and that's a dangerous game to play. You've got to be careful. This marriage, it's not as simple as it seems." Mark nodded, his throat tight. He had known it wouldn't be easy, but he hadn't realized just how complicated it was. His father's debts, his legacy, it was all coming down to this one decision. Mark's thoughts raced back to the last conversation he had with his father, the words that still haunted him. "You will carry on the family name, son. It's in your hands now." The pressure was suffocating. He thought about Eleanor again, her icy gaze, the way she spoke as if everything was already decided. "You will marry me," she had said. "We'll make it official." But Mark had to wonder, why him? Why not someone else? What was her true game? As he looked out the window at the setting sun, Mark realized that this wasn't just about saving the family name or securing wealth. It was about survival. He had to find out what Eleanor was truly after before it was too late. He had made a deal with the devil, but what would it cost him in the end? With a sigh, Mark returned to the contract, his pen hovering over the dotted line. He didn't want to do this. He didn't want to be trapped in this cold, calculated world. But sometimes, he reminded himself, you don't have a choice. Stay tuned, because what happens next will change everything for Mark and Eleanor. What started as a simple contract will soon turn into something far more complicated and far more dangerous. After the unsettling conversation with his lawyer, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor was hiding something deeper, something he wasn't meant to discover. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and power, now felt more like a gilded prison. Its cold, marble floors echoed with every step he took, and the empty hallways seemed to whisper secrets he wasn't ready to hear. Mark wandered the halls late into the night, his mind racing with the possibilities of what Eleanor might be planning. Every locked door seemed to taunt him, each one hiding something important. He stopped outside a door that seemed out of place, its brass handle gleaming faintly in the dim light. Mark couldn't help himself. He reached out, his fingers trembling as he touched the ornate key he had found earlier in Eleanor's office. His heart pounded as he carefully slipped it into the lock. The door creaked open, and Mark stepped into the room, his breath caught in his throat. The space was frozen in time, as though it hadn't been touched in decades. Dusty furniture and faded wallpaper filled the room, and on a nearby table, tarnished silver frames held photographs of a younger Eleanor with a man Mark didn't recognize. As he moved deeper into the room, his eyes were drawn to a stack of papers on the desk. The documents seemed important. Legal papers, contracts, and letters that held a story Mark hadn't yet uncovered. Mark's fingers trembled as he flipped through the papers. One letter stood out, written in sharp, slanted handwriting. It was a scathing accusation against his father, fraud, embezzlement, and deceit that had ruined Eleanor's family. As Mark read the letter, his stomach churned. The last page of the stack contained something even more damning, a marriage license, with Mark's name alongside Eleanor's. The date on the document sent a chill down his spine. It was signed weeks before their supposed wedding. Mark paused, his mind racing. This wasn't just a business deal. This was personal. Eleanor had married him for revenge, to settle an old score with his father. Mark felt a cold sweat form on his brow as the weight of the situation settled in. He wasn't just a pawn in Eleanor's game. He was the target. The documents in front of him were proof of her long-brewing resentment, and Mark had unknowingly walked straight into her trap. Before he could gather his thoughts, the door behind him creaked open. Eleanor's voice sliced through the air like a knife, cold and accusatory. "Enjoying yourself, Mark?" she said, her presence chilling the room. Mark spun around, his heart pounding. "What is this? Why did you really marry me? Was this all about my father?" Eleanor stepped into the room, her silhouette sharp against the dim light. "It's not your place to ask questions, Mark," she said, her voice low and venomous. "Just do what you're told, and you'll leave this marriage better off than you started. Isn't that enough for you?" Mark's fists clenched as he stepped toward her. "You've lied to me, manipulated me," Mark said, his voice steady but filled with anger. "This isn't a marriage, it's a trap." Eleanor's lips curled into a cold smile. "A trap?" she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Maybe you should have thought twice before signing those papers. You think you're smart, Mark, but you're just like your father, blind to the damage you cause until it's too late." Mark's mind reeled. The weight of his father's legacy hung over him, but he couldn't let Eleanor drag him into her web of lies and revenge. "If you hated him so much, why take it out on me?" he demanded. Eleanor hesitated for a long moment, her eyes softening just slightly. But it wasn't enough to break through her cold exterior. She turned on her heel, her voice a sharp whisper as she walked away. "You're in over your head, Mark. Stay out of matters that don't concern you." As Eleanor left the room, Mark stood there, shaken but resolute. He had to find a way out of this, and fast. But the more he learned, the more tangled the web seemed to become. Was he really just a pawn in Eleanor's plan? Or had he become something else entirely? Someone she was willing to use for her own twisted revenge? Mark stood frozen in the hallway, the weight of Eleanor's cryptic words pressing down on him like a heavy cloak. What had he gotten himself into? The documents he found in her secret room were more than just evidence. They were proof of a dangerous game that had been set in motion long before he arrived. Eleanor had chosen him for a reason, but why? His mind raced, his hands trembling as he thought of his father, the legacy that haunted him, and the unspoken tension between him and Eleanor. As the days passed, Mark tried to maintain his composure, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Eleanor's eyes followed him wherever he went in the mansion, her presence a constant reminder that he was a pawn in her twisted plan. The mansion, with its high ceilings and long corridors, felt more like a cage than a home. The silence in the halls was suffocating, broken only by the occasional sound of Eleanor's footsteps or the distant murmur of the staff. One evening, as he walked through the estate's garden, Mark overheard snippets of conversation from the servants, words that made his stomach churn. "He doesn't know the half of it. She never does anything without a plan." The whispers echoed in his mind as he walked on, the once beautiful garden now feeling dark and menacing. Determined to uncover more, Mark turned to his trusted friend from law school, Peter. Under the guise of a casual conversation, he asked, "Peter, if someone signed a contract under false pretenses or coercion, is there any way to get out of it?" Peter, sensing something was wrong, replied cautiously, "Hypothetically, yes. But it would depend on the evidence you have." "Why? Are you in trouble, Mark?" Mark deflected, his mind already racing with the possibilities. "Just a class project," he said quickly, ending the conversation. But the seed of doubt had been planted. There was a way out, but only if he could find the right evidence. That night, Mark returned to Eleanor's office, the familiar sense of dread creeping in as he searched through her desk. It wasn't long before he found what he was looking for, another letter, this one addressed to his father. The words were venomous, accusing his father of embezzling funds and causing irreparable damage to Eleanor's family. The letter ended with a chilling promise. "I will make sure your family pays for what you've done." Mark's heart pounded as he read the words. It wasn't just about the money. Eleanor wanted revenge, and he had unknowingly become part of her plan. Mark carefully placed the letter back where he found it, his hands shaking. He couldn't keep ignoring the truth. Eleanor had married him for one reason: revenge. And now he was trapped in her game. But what could he do? He wasn't sure if he had the strength to fight back. But one thing was clear. He couldn't allow himself to be a pawn any longer. Later that evening, as he sat in the library, his mind racing, Eleanor appeared in the doorway, her icy gaze locking onto him. "You've been busy, haven't you, Mark?" she said, her voice low and menacing. Mark froze, his breath catching in his throat. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, trying to maintain his composure. Eleanor smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Don't play games with me. If you think you can outsmart me, you're sorely mistaken. I've dealt with far more dangerous people than you." Mark's fists clenched at his sides, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't let her see how much she had rattled him. "I'm not doing anything wrong," he said, his voice steady despite the anger bubbling up inside him. Eleanor stepped closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You think you're clever, don't you? Just remember, Mark, if you betray me, you'll regret it. I'll make sure of it." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Mark standing in the center of the room, his heart pounding in his chest. Mark knew he was running out of time. Eleanor's threats were no longer subtle. He had to make a choice: stay and play along, or risk everything to expose the truth. But as the days passed, the tension between them grew unbearable. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and power, now felt like a gilded prison. Mark was trapped, and Eleanor was the key. The days dragged on, each one blurring into the next as Mark found himself caught between the life he had once known and the suffocating reality of his forced marriage. The mansion, once a symbol of status and wealth, now felt more like a prison. Eleanor's presence loomed over him at every turn, her cold gaze always watching, always calculating. She was a constant reminder of the twisted game he had been dragged into. Despite the tension, Mark couldn't ignore the occasional flicker of something beneath Eleanor's icy exterior. It was there in the brief moments when her guard slipped, a flash of vulnerability that hinted at the depths of the pain she had been carrying for so long. But even in those rare instances, the bitterness remained, like a shadow that could not be cast off. One evening, Mark sat in the grand library, his thoughts racing as he leafed through yet another set of legal papers. His father's legacy seemed to haunt him at every turn. Documents, letters, contracts, all reminders of a past that had left him with nothing but guilt and responsibility. The weight of it was suffocating. He had promised himself that he wouldn't be a part of Eleanor's revenge, but the more he uncovered, the more he realized that there was no easy way out. His mind kept returning to the marriage license he had found, the one that had been signed weeks before their supposed wedding. The realization that Eleanor had planned this from the very beginning gnawed at him. She had wanted revenge on his father, but in doing so, she had chosen him, Mark, as her pawn in this twisted game. Mark's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Mr. Harris, the estate's head butler, his face grave. "Mr. Brooks, may I have a word?" he asked, his tone more serious than usual. Mark nodded and gestured for him to sit. "What's going on, Mr. Harris?" The older man sighed, settling into the chair across from Mark. "I've seen this before, you know. People like Eleanor, they get consumed by their own bitterness. She's been playing a dangerous game with you, Mark, and I fear it's only a matter of time before it all catches up with her." Mark's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" Mr. Harris leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Eleanor's been working behind the scenes, making sure every step of this marriage is part of her revenge. But she's also hiding something she doesn't want anyone to find out." He paused, his eyes flicking toward the door. "I know she's been keeping certain things from you. Secrets about your father, about what really happened between them." Mark felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. "There's more to this than just money, Mark," Mr. Harris continued. "Much more. You need to be careful. She's been using you as a way to settle old scores, but she might not be the only one with a hidden agenda." Mark's mind raced as he processed the butler's words. Was this all part of some larger plan that he hadn't yet seen? Were there others involved? He had to find out the truth before it was too late. The following days were a blur of frantic searching and hidden conversations. Mark turned to his trusted lawyer, Peter, once again, asking questions that had been bothering him for weeks. Peter, do you think Eleanor's hiding something? Something about my father? Is there a way to dig deeper into this without her knowing? Peter, looking concerned, hesitated before answering. Mark, if you're really going to go down that road, you need to be prepared for what you might find. Sometimes the truth is more dangerous than the lies. Mark was undeterred. He needed answers, no matter the cost. One night, after Eleanor had retired to her quarters, Mark snuck into her study once again. His hands shook as he sifted through papers and documents, desperate for anything that could explain her true motivations. And then, just as he was about to give up, he found it. A letter, old and yellowed with age, written in Eleanor's handwriting. He held it up, his breath catching in his throat as he read the damning words. The letter was addressed to his father, accusing him of everything: fraud, manipulation, and betrayal. But what caught his eye was the final line. I will make sure your son suffers for what you've done. Mark's heart stopped. Was Eleanor really willing to sacrifice him just to settle old scores? His mind spun as he realized the extent of her manipulation. But the deeper question lingered. Was this all truly about revenge, or was there something even darker at play? The door creaked behind him, and Mark spun around, his heart racing. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her gaze icy and unreadable. You've been snooping around again, haven't you? She asked, her voice cold but tinged with something darker. Mark stood up, his fists clenched at his sides. Why did you really marry me, Eleanor? Was it really just about my father? Or is there something else you want? Her eyes flashed with something like anger, but also regret. For a brief moment, Mark thought he saw a flicker of emotion behind her cold facade. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. You should have stayed out of this, Mark, Eleanor said, her voice low and venomous. Now you're in deeper than you ever realized. As she turned and walked away, Mark stood there, torn between the fear of what he had uncovered and the growing determination to escape her twisted plans once and for all. Mark woke up to the sound of rain tapping against the window. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt so restless, so unsettled. Eleanor's words from the previous night echoed in his mind, and the weight of everything he had uncovered threatened to crush him. He had been swept up in this twisted game of revenge, and now he was trapped. Every step he took seemed to lead him deeper into her web, and yet, somehow, he couldn't look away. The mansion, once a place of grandeur, now felt suffocating. The lavish decor and polished floors only served as a reminder of the lies and secrets that had been buried here. Mark couldn't escape the feeling that he was being watched, that Eleanor's eyes were always on him. Every time they crossed paths, there was an unspoken tension between them, a battle of wills, of control. But today was different. Mark had made up his mind. He couldn't keep playing by her rules, couldn't keep walking in the shadows of her plans. He needed answers, and he needed to confront her once and for all. Eleanor's secrets had already cost him so much, and he couldn't afford to lose any more. The truth had to come out, even if it meant losing everything. He found Eleanor in the grand dining room, a glass of wine in her hand, staring out of the window at the storm outside. Her back was turned to him, but Mark knew she could feel him standing there. Eleanor turned slowly, her eyes cold, but there was a flicker of something else, something that might have been regret, or perhaps just weariness. You're still here, she said, her voice soft but sharp with an edge. I thought you'd be gone by now. Mark took a step forward, his voice steady but filled with determination. I'm not going anywhere until I get answers. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, almost as if she were amused. Answers? You really think you can get them from me? She took a sip from her glass, watching him over the rim. You don't understand, Mark. You never have. I understand enough, Mark said, his fists clenching at his sides. You've been using me, manipulating me from the start. This marriage, this entire thing, it's all been part of your revenge against my father. But what I don't understand is why you chose me. Why not someone else? What do you really want from me? Eleanor's expression darkened, the mask of indifference slipping for just a moment. I chose you because you're like him, she said, her voice quiet. But the words hit Mark like a punch. You're just like your father, selfish, blind to the damage you cause. You think everything can be fixed with money, with power. But it can't. Mark took a step closer, his heart pounding in his chest. This isn't just about my father, is it? You've been holding on to this for years, but it's not just revenge, Eleanor. It's about control. You want to make me pay for something I had no part in. Eleanor's lips curled into a faint, bitter smile. You're starting to understand, she said. But it's too late. This has never been about you. It's about me. About taking back what was stolen from me. Your father ruined my family, and now I will ruin his. You just happen to be in the way. Mark felt his stomach churn, the truth settling in like a heavy stone. He had been a pawn in her game all along, nothing more than a tool to settle old scores. But he couldn't let her win. He wouldn't. You can't keep hiding behind your pain, Eleanor, Mark said, his voice low but firm. You've spent so long looking for revenge, but all you've done is destroy yourself. And now you're trying to drag me down with you. I'm not going to let that happen. For a moment, Eleanor said nothing. She just stared at him, her gaze hard and unyielding. But then, her expression softened, just slightly. You're not like him, she said, almost as if she were speaking to herself. I never thought I'd say this, but maybe you're right. Mark stood there, unsure of what to say. For the first time, he saw something other than anger in her eyes. Maybe it was regret, or maybe it was just the exhaustion of a battle she had fought for too long. Either way, it was a glimpse of humanity he hadn't expected to find. But before he could respond, the door behind him opened, and the sound of footsteps echoed in the hall. It was Peter, his lawyer, accompanied by 2 police officers. They had come for Eleanor. Mark, we have a warrant for her arrest, Peter said, his voice calm but urgent. Eleanor Brooks, you're under arrest for multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and embezzlement. Mark turned to Eleanor, his heart heavy with a mix of relief and sadness. He had known this moment was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. Eleanor looked at him one last time, her gaze cold but full of something he couldn't quite place. You may think you've won, Mark, she said, her voice low, but revenge is never so easily undone. Be careful, Mark. It can consume you too. With that, Eleanor was escorted out of the room, her fate sealed. Mark stood there, watching her go, his thoughts swirling in a haze of confusion and realization. He had exposed the truth, but at what cost? The mansion, the life he had once known, was now behind him. But the shadow of Eleanor's parting words lingered in his mind. For Mark, the journey was far from over. But one thing was clear, he would never let the past control his future. He would rebuild, step by step, and find a way to move forward. The past may have shaped him, but it would not define him. Mark stood at the edge of the grand balcony, watching the storm rage outside, his thoughts in turmoil. He had done everything he could to uncover the truth, but now that it was out in the open, everything seemed to be falling apart. Eleanor had been arrested, her empire of manipulation crumbling around her. The mansion, the wealth, the power, none of it mattered anymore. It had been built on lies, on pain. And now Mark found himself at a crossroads. He could leave it all behind and start fresh, or he could stay and try to rebuild. His gaze wandered across the vast estate, now shrouded in darkness, its once beautiful grounds now just a cold reminder of the life he had lived. The people he had trusted, the relationships he had sacrificed, all of it had been for nothing. But there was still a sliver of hope, a flicker of something better waiting for him on the other side. He couldn't let the past define his future. Mark's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Peter, his lawyer. We need to talk. Meet me at the office. Mark sighed, glancing at the storm outside. He didn't want to go, but he knew he had no choice. There was still much to be done, and he couldn't afford to delay the inevitable. The office was quiet when Mark arrived, the only sound the soft hum of the air conditioning. Peter was already waiting for him, a stack of papers in front of him. He looked up as Mark entered, his expression serious but not without a hint of relief. It's done, Peter said simply, pushing the papers toward Mark. The estate has been transferred to your name. Eleanor's trial is moving forward, and it's likely she'll face significant charges. But the real question is what you want to do next. You've got a lot of power at your disposal now. What's your next move, Mark? Mark sat down, staring at the papers in front of him. He didn't feel powerful, not at that moment. He felt lost. The weight of his family's legacy, the burden of his choices, were almost too much to bear. He could sell the estate, move on, and start fresh. Or he could stay and use what he had to make a difference, to right the wrongs that had been done. I'm not sure, Mark admitted. For so long, I've been trying to escape this legacy. But now, I think it's time to face it. To stop running from the past. My father's mistakes don't have to define me, but I can't ignore them either. I need to make things right. And maybe that starts here, with this estate. Peter nodded, clearly understanding the gravity of what Mark was saying. It's a lot to take in, but I think you're on the right path. You've got a chance to do something meaningful with all of this. You don't have to follow in your father's footsteps. You can be your own man, Mark. And I'll be here to help you every step of the way. Mark smiled faintly, appreciating the support, but there was still a lingering doubt in his mind. What if he wasn't ready? What if the weight of everything was too much for him to carry? But deep down, he knew he had no choice. He had to try. As Mark left the office, the rain had stopped, and the streets were quiet. He could hear the faint rustle of leaves in the trees, a sign that things were starting to calm down. For the first time in a long while, Mark felt a sense of peace wash over him. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He was no longer a prisoner of his past. He was ready to face the future, whatever it might bring. Days passed in a haze of paperwork, phone calls, and quiet reflection. The estate had been sold, its grandeur fading into the past. The air around Mark felt lighter now, as if the weight of his family's mistakes had finally begun to lift. Yet, there was still a gnawing emptiness, a feeling of uncertainty about what lay ahead. He spent hours at the office, diving into the legal cases his firm had piled up for him, but even that couldn't keep his mind from drifting back to Eleanor. Her arrest, her words, her bitterness, everything about her haunted him. He hadn't expected closure to come so quickly, nor had he expected to feel the way he did now. Relieved, yet somehow empty. One evening, as Mark prepared to leave his office, Peter called. "Mark, you've got to come to this event. It's important." Mark frowned, glancing at his calendar. It was the launch of a new philanthropic initiative, something his firm had partnered with. He didn't want to go, but Peter insisted. "Trust me, it's a big opportunity. It's time to move forward. You're not going to get there by staying in the shadows." Mark agreed reluctantly and attended the event, walking through the crowd of professionals, his mind still tangled with thoughts of Eleanor. But as the night went on, something shifted. The people he met, the conversations they shared, all of it reminded him of a life he could still build. A future that wasn't defined by his past or the legacy of his father. He didn't need to be a part of the old world to make a difference. As the event wrapped up, Mark found himself standing by the balcony, staring out at the city skyline. The cool evening air brushed against his skin, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't thinking about Eleanor or his family's legacy. He was thinking about himself, his own future. Just then, a familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. "Mark," a soft voice called. He turned around to see Emma, the woman who had appeared in his life at the most unexpected moment. She had been his support during the darkest times, offering him a sense of normalcy when he needed it most. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Emma said with a smile, her eyes warm with genuine kindness. "I thought you might still be figuring things out." Mark smiled back, feeling the weight on his shoulders ease slightly. "I think I finally have. I'm ready to stop looking back." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, both of them knowing that this was just the beginning of a new chapter. Mark had let go of his past, and Emma had been a part of that journey. As the night came to a close, Mark walked with Emma through the crowd, feeling lighter than he had in years. The future was uncertain, but it was his to shape, and for the first time, he felt ready to face it with an open heart. Weeks passed, and Mark felt himself growing into a new life, one that was no longer shackled by the past or by the twisted games Eleanor had played. The sale of the estate was finalized, and Mark had used the proceeds not only to pay off his family's debts, but also to establish a scholarship in Harold Brooks' name, the very man Eleanor had tried to ruin for so long. It was a gesture of redemption, a way to honor someone who had been unfairly caught in the crossfire of the battle between two families. Mark had returned to law school, the place where he had always felt a sense of purpose. The weight of his father's legacy no longer pressed on him the same way it once had. With every class he took, every case he worked on, Mark felt like he was rebuilding his life. not from the ashes of his past, but from the lessons he had learned. One afternoon, as Mark sat at a cafe near the campus, he received a letter. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakable, Eleanor's. He hadn't expected to hear from her again, but something in his gut told him he couldn't ignore it. He opened the letter slowly, the familiar weight of her words heavy in his hands. Mark, the letter began, I've had much time to reflect. For years, I believed that revenge would heal the wounds Harold's death left behind. But I see now that revenge is its own prison. Your kindness, even in the face of my mistakes, taught me something I never expected. Forgiveness. Mark's heart skipped a beat as he read on. Eleanor's words were not what he had expected. They weren't filled with venom or anger, but with a strange sense of regret, a recognition that perhaps her years of bitterness had cost her more than she could ever gain. She continued, This estate is no longer a monument to my pain. It can be something more. Use it well, Mark. Make it yours. Mark closed the letter and stared out the window, the weight of her words sinking in. He had won, yes, but at what cost? The woman who had once been his adversary, his enemy, was now offering him the chance to move forward with his life. It was a strange peace, one he hadn't anticipated, but he was ready to accept it. Later that evening, Mark sat in his apartment, the letter resting on the table in front of him. He had never thought he would come to this point, where forgiveness, not revenge, would be the key to his own freedom. It was a new beginning, not just for him, but for Eleanor too. He thought back to the years of pain, the lies, and the manipulation. It had been a long road, but Mark had finally found his way out of the shadows. And now, he was ready to build something meaningful, a future of his own making, not dictated by the mistakes of his father or the bitterness of Eleanor. Mark took a deep breath, looking at the letter one last time. The past was behind him, and he was ready to move forward. He was no longer defined by the legacy of his family or the twisted games of revenge. He was his own man now, and the world ahead of him was wide open. Months had passed since Eleanor's arrest, and Mark had started to feel the weight of her influence lift from his life. The estate was gone, the debts paid, and his future was no longer tethered to the past. Yet, there was a lingering sense of unfinished business, something that kept him looking back, despite his determination to move forward. He had embraced his new life, his return to law school, his work at the Legal Aid Center, and the meaningful changes he was beginning to make in his community. The emptiness that had haunted him for so long was slowly filling with purpose. But the shadow of his past still lingered, a part of him that refused to let go. One afternoon, as Mark was reviewing a case in the library, he received another letter. This time, the handwriting was familiar, but it didn't belong to Eleanor. It was from his mother. The letter read, Mark, I know we haven't spoken much since everything happened, but I wanted to let you know that I'm proud of you. The changes you've made, the path you're on, it's more than I ever expected. Harold's death left us all broken, but you've managed to rebuild yourself, and I can see now that you've truly let go of the past. You are your own man, Mark, and that's all I've ever wanted for you. Mark felt a lump form in his throat as he read his mother's words. They were simple, but they held more meaning than anything he had ever heard from her. For years, he had felt like he was living in the shadow of his father's mistakes, but now, it seemed that he had finally found a way to step into the light. That evening, as he sat on his apartment balcony, Mark thought about the journey he had been on, everything he had lost, and everything he had gained. Eleanor's words, her parting threats, had haunted him, but in the end, they had only made him stronger. He was no longer a pawn in her game, nor a prisoner of his father's legacy. He had chosen his own path, and it was one of healing, of forgiveness, and of self-discovery. He smiled, the first genuine smile he had felt in a long time, as he gazed out at the city lights. The world was vast, filled with endless possibilities. And for the first time, Mark felt ready to take it all on. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing. He would face it with his head held high, knowing that the past no longer defined him. He had let it go, and in doing so, had found a new beginning.